Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of designing alternate forms for existing Generation 5 Pokemon to fit into a Legends Arceus style narrative set in an ancient Unova region. This is Pokémon Legends Kyurem. Okay, so I know that the awesome stone axe Haxorus in the thumbnail is probably what brought you all to this video. Well, it's definitely what brought you all to this video. Yes, we're going to tackle that design today. However, this video has a lot more in it than just one alternative pseudo-legendary design. Today, we're going to finish designing the final two human characters in the list of the Aleosian Trial Captains, while also talking about the Pokemon that I chose to be the alpha Pokemon for this region. Alright, hold up. Editor's note here. I'm going to say Totem Pokemon and Alpha Pokemon a lot. Neither one of those are right. I meant Noble Pokemon. Anyways, let's get back to it. Not only that, we have an additional two-stage Ghost-type Pokemon design that we're actually going to start with right now. Joltick and Galvantula are based on ticks, and tarantulas sort of, but the concept behind their idea is that they drain electricity in a similar way to how the parasitic tick drains blood from their hosts. When I was coming up with ideas for the ancient Pokemon in the series, this was one of the first ones that I thought of, as electricity, and specifically electrical devices, would not yet have been invented in this era of the Pokemon world, so Joltick would presumably have to get their energy from somewhere else. In a sort of dark turn, I went back to the real-life inspiration in the tick and observed its similarities to vampires, reasoning that this might make a good ghost-type Pokemon design. I gave it this white head that had a hairline separating the front and back of its body that was sort of shaped like the hairline of Dracula, and I used a version of its electrostatically charged fur slicked back to create the shape of a vampire's slicked back hair. I also reused the same idea to create this shape of like a vampire's collar above the legs. The color palette was something I'd basically decided on before I'd even started, and the black and white really helped differentiate this version from the original, and helped these minor tweaks become something that looked surprisingly unique. Joltick, the tick Pokemon. This is the smallest of the Pokemon found in Unova to date. They use electrical sensing organs at the base of their hair to track down their victims. Once they've located a meal, they jump down from their treetop homes and attach themselves discreetly to large Pokemon that they prey upon. They then drain their power through their fangs, sapping the Pokemon's energy. It is said that if you should go through a prolonged period of drowsiness, you probably have a Joltick somewhere on your person. Once Joltick was done, creating this version of Galvantula was relatively easy. Comparatively less would change from the original when compared to Joltick, as my Galvantula kept most of its original shape. The one minor change I made was similar to its pre-evolved form, and that is how I largely removed any electrostatically charged fur imagery, changing these shapes to something that more resembled a smooth and glossy cloak. When coloring this Pokemon, I had the initial thought of adding more red to the design, but almost immediately I went against it, as keeping this Pokemon's color palette more mute actually helps communicate its ghost typing better. In both of the Pokedex entries, I hinted at how these Pokemon might one day have a predilection for the electric type, with Joltick using electric signals to hunt and Galvantula using electric webs to trap its prey. This hopefully gives a not as obvious as usual hint towards how they will one day become their modern day forms. Galvantula, the hollow spider Pokemon in the evolved form of Joltick. Having sapped all of the energy from their hosts, they used their newfound power to evolve. Large gatherings of these Pokemon make others flee in fear. In these groups, they create massive nests made of a silky string-like material. Galvantula coat this silk in their saliva, so that when this silk comes in contact with a person or Pokemon, it delivers a shocking sensation. In cases of smaller Pokemon, this shock paralyzes them, allowing for Galvantula to safely drag them back into their dens. This next Pokemon design, and the final one of the video, was suggested by a commenter. @DittoGuy suggested that we create a Stone Axe Haxorus line. I immediately loved this idea, and the prompt led to a pretty great rework of the design, in my opinion. Since Axew and Fraxure have tusks in place of Haxorus's axes, I had to think of a different way to represent this stone axe idea. I thought about flint knapping, which is the process that ancient humans from the Stone Age went through to make their stone tools, and why these tools had similar shapes due to the knapping patterns that they used. I thought using this idea in the evolution of technology from flint-knapped tools into more recognizable stone axes, then into the modern axes that are represented in the real Haxorus, would be a great way to go about this evolutionary line. And so Axew's tusks would take on the shape of these flint-knapped knives and axes in its new form. To further differentiate them from their original designs, I added a few Stone Age / Dinosaurian qualities, including a red sail on its head, which was an exaggeration of an existing structure that Axew already had, but also made it look a bit like a Spinosaurus, which worked really well. The other addition was changing the neck ridge structure into a fuzzy pelt of some sort. The color palette I landed on took some figuring out, as the colors for this line were deceptively difficult to come up with. But at the end of the day, I settled on a palette that was adjacent to the existing Haxorus's shiny form. Axew, the Flint Tusk Pokemon. This rare and playful little Pokemon spends its time running about in the mountains and playfully shattering boulders with their rock-hard tusks. This behavior results in the chipping of these tusks, sharpening them for future battles. The sail on their head keeps them from overheating during hot summer months of the region, and the fuzzy pelt helps shield them from the snowy weather on mountain peaks. I did Fraxure on a live stream while I was working on this video last week, and I'm glad I was able to do it, as I haven't been streaming nearly as much as I would have wanted to recently. This Fraxure ended up using most of the design ideas from Axew, but evolved, no pun intended, to fit with the proportions of a larger monster. I played around with the idea of exaggerating the spotted pattern on the belly up into like this dirt pattern of like an ancient Pokemon, but I went back on this thought as I felt like it busied the design too much. One of the suggestions that was made in the chat during the stream was to give Fraxure a club tail, and I loved that idea. It added an extra layer of dinosaurian flair to the design, while also keeping the simple weapon imagery I was going for. This version of Fraxure reminds me somewhat of my regional form of Rampardos and Coranidos that I made for the last season of Pokepaint. Fraxure, the Flint Tusk Pokemon and the evolved form of Axew. The giant sail on their head helps them balance as they charge down their opponents at high speed. Their sharp tusks have been honed over countless battles to make a deadly combination with the club on their tail. As they mature, the fur around their neck grows to cover their body and forms an armor-like outer layer. Our last Pokemon of the day is the final form, Haxorus, which I did shortly after the live stream ended. Shape-wise, not much changes between original Haxorus and Stone Axe Haxorus, except for, of course, the Stone Axe part. The red sails I kept from the first form, and I realized in drawing this one, how similar Haxorus' face looks to a vulture's face with its hooked beak, which is just a funny little detail that I never noticed until now. The color palettes were of course the most challenging part. I wanted to strike a balance between making it read as the last form of the first two, while also giving it its own unique distribution of colors as is done in the original line. I eventually came down to choosing between a darker black color palette with a set of light gray axes or a duller gray palette with dark axes that further matched the pre-evolved forms. Although I went with the darker palette in the end, which is technically less consistent when compared to the other two, I feel like the rule of cool applies to this one more than anything. As yes, though the gray palette may have been more visually consistent, look at that black one, that looks pretty sleek. Haxorus, the axe jaw Pokemon and the evolved form of Fraxure. Their entire body is an armament of deadly weapons. The axe-like blades that extend from the front of their snout are actually a set of overdeveloped tusks, imbued with the minerals that it eats when it chews on hard stones. Their armor plating appears to be formed from a solidified form of the fuzzy pelt that can be found on their young. They are highly aggressive and will challenge anyone who stumbles into their territory. Though that's it for my Pokemon's designs today, we have a few more designs to go through before we finish off. But before we get into the human characters, I'm going to talk a bit about the Pokemon that I chose for Unova's Alpha Pokemon. Alongside the trial captains, you would also have to take down 4 Alpha Pokemon. And those types were originally Fire, Electric, Ice, and Dragon, if you remember. And I chose these types to add up to Kyurem's types, in the electric form, the fire form, and the ice form. However, I removed the dragon typing in this to steel type for a few reasons. One was not to double up with type representation, as one of the trial captains would be a dragon type master, and also I had a specific idea of a Pokemon that I wanted to include that I couldn't if I didn't change this part. The Alpha Pokemon would go as follows. The Electric type Alpha Pokemon would be the first one you would come across, and it is an Ancient Golem. It could be found in the Lost Lorn Forest area guarding some sort of shrine. The second Alpha Pokemon would be an as of this moment unrevealed Fire type Pokemon that I plan to tackle in a future video. The Ice Alpha Pokemon would be a Beartic, and it could be found in the snowy area near the Icarus Moors. And finally, the Steel-type Alpha Pokemon would bring in a new evolution to the Unova region in the Pokemon Kingambit. I think including Kingambit would have a few lore implications relating to Galighten, my own Shelmet evolution. I imagine these two Pokemon would have a rivalry of some sort in this era of the Pokemon world, and that when Galighten eventually goes extinct, as I hint at in its Pokedex entry, the Kingambit leave Unova as they no longer have any challenging opponents to fight. I think this gives a good explanation to why Kingambit cannot be found in modern Unova, and also includes an interesting evolved form of the Pokemon that was introduced recently. Moving on to the last 2 trial captains, we have our first of today in the ancestor for Skye. If you remember in the last video, I talked about how I based many of these ancestor designs off of different cultures from around the world to reference how Unova's landmarks have inspiration from many unique world cultures. I based this trainer's look on the ancient Romans, as I thought that a Roman toga could be a cool spin on the flying type imagery that exists on Skyla's modern day design. Surprisingly, I was able to keep something that resembled Skyla's bulky gloves in the gauntlets that I gave this character. This ancestor wouldn't be super different when compared to Skyla. However, I wanted to make 1 or 2 little changes that would make this character stand more on their own. And one of them was I took her hair out of the bun that it is in its original form, and instead let this version of the character's hair fall into a shape that more resembled spread wings. Yeah, that might be a bit on the nose, but hey, it's an anime design. They're kind of supposed to be on the nose. Keeping with that on the nose idea, I decided to use a Scottish name that has similar roots to Skyla, and that is Skye, spelled S-K-Y-E. Skye would be the third of the captains that you would face, and she would reside in the newly built Celestial Tower, with a Pokemon team of Braviary, Archeops, and Swanna. The last of the trial captains and the leader of the Aliosians would be the ancestor to Champion Iris. I threw in some Native American imagery here to tie the world culture's idea together with an American culture, which is what Unova is based on. And this also helped me reference Champion Alder, who has his own Native American imagery in his real design. I thought that there might be some cool implications with this parallel, like maybe this type of outerwear is the traditional garb for the leaders of the Aliosians, giving an explanation for why Alder dresses the way that he does. I don't know, I just think it's a neat idea. The character's name would reference dragons a little bit in the way that it references the Elder Scrolls games, but it would mostly reference Alder's name. Unlike the other trial captains, Eldin would be the mission giver for much of the first and second acts of the narrative, and he would be met first in the Lacunosa Temple, and then again for his battle in Dragon Spiral Tower. During his battle, he has the team Zweilous, Druddigon, and the ancient form Haxorus. So that wraps up our human characters and inches us closer and closer to the final few episodes of Legends Kyurem. It's kind of crazy to think that this mini-series is almost over already. It's pretty exciting though at the same time. I'm currently traveling out of the country. I actually finished this video a week in advance so that I could get it out to you all on time while I'm away from my computer and don't have access to any of my art programs or social media platforms while I'm away in Iceland. That being said, next episode I'll be wrapping up the Pokedex with the final of my ancient Pokemon designs. So if you have any more ideas, I'd definitely comment them ASAP, as I'll start work on that video in a few days when I return from my trip. That about does it for now, so as always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then leave a like and feel free to subscribe and get notified when I upload next. I immediately loved this idea, and the prompt led to a pretty great rework. I immediately loved this idea, and the prompt led to a pretty great rework.